Hey, get in, fellas. We're going back to therapy. It is Wednesday, February 19th, and we are talking attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, as we'll call it all episode today, as the neurodiversity block continues. And our goal as you wake up in the morning and go to bed tonight is to understand the experience of a condition that you might not have thought of, understand what it's like to have ADHD, and as we move forward, other ND type conditions. So, what we're going to start with, something we can all relate to, not necessarily having ADHD, but having difficulty concentrating. We're going to call this segment, Why Can't I Focus and What Can I Do About It? So stay tuned and hear about all the different reasons we have trouble concentrating and, more importantly, what we can do about it. My boy Chef Max comes back to talk to us about growing up with ADHD, what the experience is like, and how people can make the most of their lives while struggling with some of those basic challenges. And finally, we will induct Bromotion's Hall of Fame and, based on my research, likely ADHD, as many celebrities do, candidate Ryan Ken Gosling. Let's go. Right, y'all, just me this week. Here in the neurodiversity block, we're trying to really think about the experience of having all these conditions. I want you to have woken up this morning not really understanding what it's like to have been in the experience, the mind, the body, the soul of somebody with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, as we'll get to all these conditions. When I thought about today and ADHD, I thought that social media craze of more and more people wondering, thinking, do I have ADHD, as it really, really spiked up during the pandemic. You all remember this. Instagram, TikTok were blowing up with those websites, Done, Cerebral, those really what turned into pill mills for ADHD diagnoses. And guys, I'm over at Talkiatry. We do a good job now. And I've had dozens of patients come from those websites and tell me they would see a doctor for under 5 minutes, the first appointment, and under 2 minutes from there. So it became a real big problem, to the point that there has been a national shortage of the substrate, the chemical that is used to make the stimulant medications, the Ritalins, the Adderalls, the things that you all know and love. It's been a problem for years now because it was a skyrocket. The supply legit could not meet the demand, regardless of how much money that stuff's worth. And so I wanted to think today, if the question is, why can't I focus? Which during the pandemic, it was hard, right? We'll talk about many reasons that people can't focus. And number one on that list is usually you got shit going on. All right. So we're going to talk about why can't I focus, and more importantly, what to do about it. What are the non-medication strategies that we can all use to help our focus and concentration throughout the day? Number one, we're talking ADHD today. Might as well just dive into it. How could you know if you had ADHD? The answer is if it's always been a problem. All right. You do not sprout ADHD later in life. Adult ADHD is not a thing. It is not confirmed in our community. It is not a thing we talk about. You can be an adult with ADHD. You can be an adult who still struggles with the symptoms that they struggled with as a kid. It might look different. You might not be spazzing out in class, up and walking around all over the place because you've learned manners, but you still could be struggling with that inner restlessness or that difficulty concentrating, inattentive symptoms. It is a temperament condition. So we've talked about climate versus storms when we talked about borderline personality versus bipolar disorder. You have ADHD, it is your climate. That is always how you are. And sure, it can worsen with stress. It can change here and there in intensity, but the core issues don't come and go. It would not be ADHD if that was the case. One of the funny ways I talk with my patients about, and we do not condone the use of illicit drugs or taking other people's medications on this show. But when people want to know some hints of do I have ADHD versus is there another reason, I ask, have you ever used a stimulant? So cocaine, someone else's Adderall, MDMA. If you take those things and you feel like you rev up in gear, that is not ADHD, okay? The idea with ADHD, and you'll hear Chef Max talk about this here in a little bit, is that we shift down in gear. Many people who really have ADHD who try cocaine, for example, have told me, oh my God, it's the only time I could relax. It's the only time I could read a book. It's the only time, and so I would joke that if you're at a frat party and people are doing some of the nose candy, if everybody's, bumping their chests and slapping each other around and talking a mile a minute and you want to go sit outside and lay in the grass, likely that you have ADHD, versus what is true is just that people like stimulants. Hence, methamphetamine is a major problem. And again, the stimulant shortage overall shows how many people are just reaching for those medications to cure any number of reasons we cannot focus. So non-ADHD reasons, we call these adjustment disorders. And that is that I'm currently stressed out or I'm currently sad right now about something that is going on in my life. Changes at work, difficulty in your relationship. I will often have people who come to my clinic and ask, am I depressed? And I'll say, I don't know. Your life is depressing, or you have had something big happen recently. And so it's hard to say whether you are capital D depressed or if you just got some shit going on. Why did people have a hard time during COVID? Why are people having a hard time as the political climate changes now? Because they got shit going on. They're thinking about a lot of stuff. That is far and away the number one reason that somebody would have problem focusing and trouble concentrating. 2 is anxiety. Similar to I got shit going on, but generalized anxiety is a more formal diagnosis. It implies that more days than not, you are struggling with anxiety. This, there's comes and goes, there's ups and downs with anxiety, worry about bad things, worrying about things going wrong, just worrying in general. But more realistically, in the way we see anxiety, it's more of a temperament trait, kind of like we talked about with ADHD, except these usually sprout up a little bit later in life, in your teens or your 20s. So we'd work on that with CBT. Within a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, there is a part that you can check the box of that is, quote, difficulty concentrating or your mind going blank. So again, difficulty concentrating can be found on a variety of conditions. Additionally, in depression, within the diagnosis of depression, quote, impaired ability to think, concentrate, or make decisions, end quote. So depression, as we quantify it, is also a climate versus storms kind of thing, right? A lot of us, when we're depressed all the time, usually says there's something going on in our lives to work on, or maybe some complex trauma from our childhood that's left us just kind of in a below average mood state. But generally, depression, as we think of it nowadays, is in these storms. They come in waves. And so if you're okay concentrating, sometimes, most of the time, and then you've got days your energy's low, you're feeling down, your thoughts are a little more negative, that looks more like depression as we think about it as these discrete periods of time. And of course, when your thoughts are more negative, when you're more sad and everything's more gloomy, it's going to be difficult to concentrate. And then even more common than ADHD, when I see people who've had lifelong issues concentrating, is the idea of trauma. We talked about when I got shit going on, that's acute trauma, so chronic trauma, AKA my childhood was not smooth sailing, all right? So amongst the core features of PTSD is thinking often about the traumatic event you experienced. Within the diagnostic criteria is problems with concentration. And so usually when people have what we now call complex PTSD or body keeps the score kind of shit, you have core problems with anxiety, depression, and concentration. So we can bundle some people up like this. If they have a fear of abandonment, that looks like borderline personality. The label doesn't matter as much as far more likely if you had a rough upbringing, you have trauma to be worked on, DBT skills to build, slowing it down to do, than that you have ADHD organically, again, which is more biologic than environmental. So there's a bunch of stuff, a lot of education there, but I just want people to understand and to think really hard that if you have had difficulty concentrating, if you're having, or sometimes you have, that those are amongst the core reasons. Now, what are we going to do about it? All right. So what are some of those major things that people who have ADHD or these other reasons struggle, and how can we go about attacking them? So guys, this is, I'm going to list some things, talk about it a little bit, but go find this. I'm using the helpguide.org, which is a great website, but you can find tips and tricks for helping your organization everywhere. All right. Tons of good books on the topic. If you're looking for resources, just reach out to the socials, to the email, and let us know. I'm happy to recommend some stuff for you. So organization is something we all struggle with. Planners, carry mine around all the time. To-do lists. We also need to make sure that we're designating spaces for our work. Okay, with visual cues. This is going to be a theme you see the entire time that I'm talking. We're going to write. We're going to see things with our eyes. People who have ADHD struggle with verbal learning and learning things just through that. And so we're going to want to see things more regularly. So we avoid procrastination. I know I've taught you never to avoid. Procrastination is one thing we get to avoid. It is extremely difficult to sit down, hold yourself accountable to do the most important thing now, which is why we set time aside every day specifically to organize your space. That's your desk where you're going to be working, and to plan your day. Plan ahead. Set aside 10 minutes is usually my recommendation every day to plan your day. My daily calendar has a schedule in it, most important tasks, these kinds of things. This is by anecdote. Those are my homies in the organization game. And just making sure you have time where you think through the day and plan ahead. Speaking of time management, people with attention things, concentration problems tend to have struggles arriving on time. All right. So you want to plan ahead, as we were talking about, to arrive early and act accordingly. Everything you think is going to take a certain amount of time. Add 5 minutes. How will you know what 5 minutes looks like? Wearing a watch and using timers. I cannot tell you the amount of patients I have who have avoided using medications for ADHD because they keep themselves on a timer. We'll call this the Pomodoro method in terms of communication and time management and prioritization, is giving yourself 20 minutes to do a non-preferred task, 10 minutes of a mental break, take a walk, check out a little bit, go get a drink, a snack, come back. 20 minutes on, 10 minutes off. Hugely successful for people who find themselves wandering and find themselves having difficulty staying on tasks. We want to limit distractions, minimize commotion, choosing a logical space around us. And remember, when we're thinking, ooh, I have this idea, just write it down. Stay on task, because the main thing that people with ADHD struggle with is, if I don't do this thing now, I'm going to lose it. I'm going to forget it. So we build trust in our own brains by writing things down and making sure we can come back to them when we have time. Communication is also a major problem when you're struggling with concentration. Most people think of themselves as task-doing robots. If I can't accomplish things, then that must mean I have ADHD, when really people who've had ADHD understand that communication, socializing, and those things are very difficult. The tendency to cut people off, the tendency to think to themselves, I want to get this point across, but I know I'm too polite to interrupt the conversations. And that is a very common experience for people with ADHD. So what I ask homies to do is, you're already carrying your planner. I want pen and paper, and then lock back into the conversation so you can stay present and mindful. Specifically, to make sure you're hearing things correctly, I want you to echo the directions. It's say your wife, your husband, your kid, anybody in your life is giving you something to do. You want to repeat that back to them so that you make sure you're hearing them right and limiting issues with communication. Lifestyle modifications, exercise, diet, sleep, all research backed and shown to help with concentration issues of any kind when we're taking care of ourselves in that way, as we might imagine. And most importantly, guys, slow it down. Okay, we need to actively practice slowing our mind down and focusing on one thing at a time. This is why I've hammered those DBT skills and hammered those mindfulness skills. If you're interested in working on mindfulness skills and DBT as a construct, I highly recommend a website that is free, capital FREE, called dialecticalbehaviortherapy.com. It is a self-guided tool that you can use to walk through the steps of DBT and improve your life, as I know it did for me and millions of others. All right. So thanks for sticking in there, and I hope you got something out of that. After the break, we'll be back with my dear friend, Chef Max Wertheim, to talk about the experience and understanding building empathy around people with ADHD. Welcome back to one of my best friends on this round ball we call Earth, Chef Max Wertheim, here to kick off the neurodivergence block, talking about ADHD. Chef Max is a Cleveland Heights native, grew up good friends with Jason Kelsey there at Cleveland Heights High. Knew him from Ohio State undergrad. Max, look at you repping today. I want to show the people all your chip gear.
Yeah, undisputed.
Red. The reason we call Max Chef Max, if you are in the Ohio State or Columbus area, Max is a chef and co-owns a restaurant with a good buddy of his called Stacked Burger Company out in Worthington. Great family-owned spot, good time, good burgers. And Max is a Cleveland sports fan, unfortunately, and joined us once in the past to talk about distress tolerance as it relates to DBT skills. Max, in these last few months, how have you been tolerating distress? You working on anything?
I think I've been doing a better job, honestly, of dealing with it. Yeah, I've been taking sort of a breath, taking a moment in stressful situations. I've had I'd say zero like significant outburst in those ways, probably like in the recent months.
And it's been pretty stressful for Max. We talked about him opening up this new burger restaurant, and Jordan can strike this from HIPAA, but the co-owner of his restaurant had a heart attack on their opening night. And so Max has been managing a new restaurant all by himself. Jordan is back to work, but was dealing with a lot of stress there and a really busy time as the restaurant got kicked up off the ground. Speaking of places where chefs thrive, the kitchen, Max is here to talk to us about attention deficit and hyperactive disorder, or ADHD, to kick off our neurodivergence block. No surprise of knowing him very well, Max has had rip-roaring ADHD and has a good story to tell us about understanding what that life is like. Max, we're just going to start these off really generally. I've got the clinical lens, but how would you define, or when you hear ADHD, how would you say it in a way that explains what it's been like in your life? How do you define it?
The way I define it for myself is constant sort of movement in my brain is the way it feels like, which can make it hard to focus because it feels like thinking two steps ahead of the conversation that I'm currently in. Or if I'm the one listening, instead of listening, you're often thinking of your response. And in an effort to like try and hold on to the thing that you want to say without interrupting, then you often forget or you either lose attention or you forget the thing you wanted to say. So it's a struggle to hold like both of those things often, of paying attention to the conversation, but also being an active participant without interrupting.
Yeah, I love that you started off with that, Max, so strongly, because I talk about that with my patients all the time, where it's ADHD is difficult when you're in the conversation and you're like, I want to say red circle, and then you're like, I'm going to forget. So I just say red circle in my mind over and over, but not to interrupt. By the time there's a space, you go red circle and everyone's like, Max, we've been talking about blue squares for like a minute, bro. Where have you been?
Yeah.
So I'll say that to my patients all the time, and it seems like the most relatable experience. As somebody who seems like they have ADHD, Max, like me, but really it's just good old-fashioned anxiety, it's hard for me to relate. And Max and I have been super close friends for a long time, and I thought he'd be a good person, as you can hear already, pretty verbally skilled, to come on and talk with us about what this experience is. So Max did a really nice job there of talking about thoughts are moving fast. When the thoughts are moving fast, it feels disorganized for people, and that makes it difficult to focus. When things are moving fast, it's hard to stay organized. People often lose things. In the clinical world, Max, we have two types of ADHD: inattentive and hyperactive types. We colloquially think of girls as more inattentive, boys as more hyperactive, and most often people have combined type ADHD. So we use different scales, different questionnaires to help tease those things out. What's most important is ADHD is a temperamental condition. And we'll have Max kick us off here after this, thinking about that you have to be under age 7 when these symptoms started to be diagnosed with ADHD. And that is because it is considered a condition of your temperament. It is not something you acquire later in life, as in anxiety, trauma, depression are all things that can make it difficult for us to concentrate. Max, when did you first, flashing all the way back there, like when did you first think, like, is this a problem? Am I different from other people?
Yeah, I don't know if it was something that I thought was a problem, but clearly other people in my life, my teachers, parents, adults in the room, whatever you want to call them, were aware that I was often not creating trouble purposefully, but like interrupting or creating disturbances by whatever the hell it was that I was doing. And that would be anything from like playing with everything and anything that was in and around my desk, starting in like kindergarten or first grade. And that usually involved me being moved to like the back of the classroom in first grade is probably my earliest memories of that, or being moved to the hallway for quiet study time while everyone else was doing something else.
Which is hilarious. How did being moved out into the hallway by yourself go?
Yeah, I just wouldn't do anything. I just played with whatever was at hand, for sure. Like in first grade. And then I also had like lots of like what they called, probably at the time, creating a commotion. I remember instances of like being on a field trip and kicking over a bucket of water because of lack of impulse control and things like that. And that's like from a young age, getting sent home from school with lots of notes from my parents.
I think about this all the time with people with ADHD, Max. You're really hitting that on the head where it's like lack of impulse control, you're interrupting class, you're getting kicked out. Do you remember, I mean, kind of feeling like, what am I? Am I a bad kid? Is there something wrong with me? Because oftentimes kids with ADHD get a lot of that negative feedback.
I don't think at that age I was. That probably, I think, started much like later in life, I would say. I think at that age, I don't think I was able to differentiate between myself and others. I didn't like being sent out, but at the same time, I was just like, well, this is free time for me. It's the way a kid's mind that doesn't, want to be in school works. At some point, they also thought that maybe I had a learning disability, and I guess ADHD would be considered a learning disability in
Yeah.
many
Yeah. And
aspects.
there's a
But
really common overlay, right, with dyslexia and ADHD,
yeah.
autism and ADHD, all the other kind of difficulties there. So it stands to reason, but do you think that was like your grades weren't doing well?
Maybe initially they weren't great, I'd say, like, and then like I pretty quickly, am able to like pick things up. So I think I caught up very quickly once we figured out something that worked better for me sometime in first grade. I remember at one point having, lots of those addition tables and subtraction tables that you do when you're really young, like the time tests and things on those. And uh at one point doing badly on those, and then at some point shortly after, like getting 100% on every single one and finishing like well before all my classmates. I'm not exactly sure what changes we made. It was probably something with studying at home with my parents rather than them just trusting me to do it by myself.
Yep. Yep. And you were the firstborn, so it's not like your parents had much of an idea of what was coming to them. Like you said, you weren't really sure what changed. Do you remember when you first either got testing, went to a doctor to think about medication or anything along those lines?
Yeah, that was probably closer to middle school. Now, I
Okay.
remember definitely being on lots of like specific little education plans through like first, second, third grade, and sometime around there, those sort of ending where I was, I don't know, deemed that I was handling all my stuff without needing like special attention to take care of it. And at that point, I was, in the, gifted and talented, whatever programs they had. Because I think they decided that a lot of my inattentiveness was because I was, bored with the material as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting construct we've always hung on, right? Like kids who are bored in class, they do better if they were challenged more. So we see that, but Max makes a good point of a good example of the people who like once they have the skill set, they're going to do well, and we hear a lot of people who talk about, well, I overcame it. I found ways to cope with ADHD until I got to middle school, high school, college, when the material got harder and it all caught up to me. It obviously becomes a much bigger issue for those kids who don't have those blessed IQ points. ADHD, again, autism, low IQ, they end up in special needs classes and really, really struggle with behavior. So, Max, when you're saying it was closer to middle school, what ended up happening as far as treatment and that kind of attention go?
I'd say it was probably sometime around sixth or seventh grade where my parents, I think, took me. I couldn't tell you possibly whether it was a psychiatrist or a therapist or, I don't remember. But I believe whoever it was worked in conjunction with my pediatrician. So my guess would be not a psychiatrist.
Look at you
Um,
piecing those things together as a KGB. You now know the differences. We could call
right.
Rena or Steven up, Max's parents. They'd be able to tell us.
Yeah.
I'm sure they would. I'm sure they
Yeah.
would.
Yeah, he had me do, I remember, a couple assessments. And then we also, like, had some things that he gave out that my teachers filled out for him to also assess. Had some, like, one on one sessions without my parents as well. And I think pretty quickly was diagnosed with, I believe at the time, ADD.
The Vanderbilts are the name of the assessments that are given to parents and teachers. Just kind of throwing some of these fun facts in there. But Max, it's good because it sounds like you had what would be a pretty proper and thorough assessment. You saw a mental health professional, you got the information from not only yourself, but your teachers and your parents. And that's really the best way to go about this. And we'd say it's the gold standard for diagnosing ADD versus sometimes people's pediatricians just are like, yep, you can tell, let's go. Or the parents can just give a report. So that's really a nice way that you went about it. Do you remember what happened from there after that
Um,
evaluation stage?
yeah, we worked on a prescription. We did a few different like blind trials essentially of different dosages of Adderall, with like one of them being an absolute disaster where it was just way too much. And I remember having like a complete like speed freak out, a la like Saved by the Bell, Jesse, like
I'm so excited.
yeah,
I
but
just
like as
can't
like, like a
hide it.
12-year-old who like
What do you
didn't
mean?
know that he had like taken too much of a drug that could do any, it was really weird.
Why? Why? You
Oh,
said it was blind, like you weren't starting and then going up in the dose. What's up with that?
yeah, I couldn't possibly tell you. It's been a long time. I remember we had, this week you have 5 different weeks of dosages and one was going to be a placebo and then we
Wow,
were
maybe
going
you
to
were in a
report.
trial of some kind, like a research trial of some kind.
Could be, I don't know.
Yeah, because
Um,
there's no real way that clinical practice makes any sense doing that. That doesn't
okay.
make any sense in clinical
Well,
practice.
we immediately after one day of that like bad dosage, like just
Yeah.
didn't take any more of those, obviously.
Yeah, Max,
But found
do
a
you mind?
dosage of Adderall that did, eventually work for me. And it was, like certain amount in the morning and a smaller amount in the afternoon or something like that.
This is tough, Max. I really love the language, and I'll share some of this that my adult patients use who never get on a stimulant until their adulthood, but always needed it. Can you remember what changed or what it felt like to finally be properly medicated for the ADHD?
I think a lot calmer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like a calmness of like the mind almost. Lot less fidgety, like with my hands and my feet, which for me are like unmedicated, pretty constantly in motion, able to like sit down and like complete a task for school, which was something that like without it was like work for 10 minutes, take 20 minutes to rummage around my room doing something completely unrelated, sit
Yep.
down for another 10 minutes. It was a lot more of a process. Whereas I feel like with the Adderall, I almost was able to like hyper focus, which like was great in some cases for schoolwork, but like I tended to, because of that, like in the summer, cut down my dosages
Yep.
or things like that.
Yeah, I wonder if, and these were the earlier days of using these medicines, Max. And I wonder, we talk a lot about the overprescribing in the 90s, and you may very well have fallen into that camp. If you remember the South Park episode, Max, I'm sure you do, with the Christina Aguilera bugs that come when the kids are all overdosed on Ritalin.
Yeah.
And that idea, like I tell my patients this as I'm prescribing stimulants, like I want you to be able to like do normal in and out of activity. And so sometimes when we do overprescribe people, it really does it feels like we've overshot the mark, in terms of that. So Max, it may be possible that your dose may have been a little high, which is hard on kids because inevitably the world is not really fit for them to have ADHD, even though, as we'll learn with Max, having that temperament can be super helpful in so many ways. And it can really lead to a lot of successful careers. It just doesn't lend itself to sitting in traditional school for 8 hours a day. Max, would you remember, like, after the medications got tuned up, were there other ways you got help for ADHD, things you practiced or support you got? And because inevitably you had to learn how to be organized, learn how to get things done because you've never done it.
I'm sure there was more to it. I don't know if I can necessarily like. I remember that I saw that therapist for a few years, probably until I think we just decided that I decided that I wasn't gaining much from it on a
Yeah,
however basis. I think it was probably monthly, something
yeah,
along those lines. Um, and then more just worked with my pediatrician probably at the time on fine tuning my dosages and pills. And I think we maybe switched to a different therapist at another point, eventually adjusted, switched me from Adderall to Strattera and possibly Concerta at
yeah.
some
You were
other
on
point.
Concerta for some window of time because I remember that back when we lived
Okay,
together.
see, yeah, I thought you would.
So, yeah. These are
Sorry.
all different classes of medicines used for ADHD. So, Max, one of the things that I want people to think about is what it's like as an adult when we think of these childhood conditions. Max, like as you finished schooling and shifted, what do you think? How do you think the ADHD ended up guiding some of your life choices, your career, and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it played a huge role in pretty much every aspect of my like adult life. From, not really ever finding any kind of passion at Ohio State while I was there. I switched majors many times, as those who know me from college could attest, that I think I had like three or four different majors in like a 3 year, 2.5 year span.
Yeah.
And it was just because mostly an attention issue where, especially at that point, being away from my parents, where my medication was up to me. And for the most part, I think there was an aspect always of never really enjoying being on any of the different medications that I had been prescribed over the years,
Yeah.
where I was always just trying to take them as necessary to get through whatever I was doing, not because it made me feel better, like
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah. I work with my patients a lot on that, Max, because you're a really good example. If you're on maybe not the right fit of medication for you, which we don't know why, some people do better on one class of the medicines versus the others, and not really noticing the other ways that it helps you, especially when you're a 20-year-old dude, which is the peak of our dumbness, right? Of 20-year-old men.
Yeah.
It's look, if you're not seeing this as anything but a means to an end to get your schoolwork done, then why on earth would you take this at other points in your life? So, Max,
Right.
I wonder as we zoom out a little bit, maybe in reflection, do you think socially, your relationships, that ADHD makes a difference there? And maybe you've noticed that more as you've gotten older.
Definitely. Socially, larger group settings, it can definitely be a struggle with like sensory overload in some aspects, where I struggle to like stay in one conversation if there's three others happening around me and I'm picking up little bits and pieces of all of them that to whatever group I may be standing with, it probably seems like I'm super distracted because I am.
And that's like one example, Max. I want you, I know you'll have some others for us of when I have adult, parents who either don't give their ADHD medications to their kids on the weekend. I ask, people of mine, young adults who either do or don't take their medicines on non-work days. It's like, doesn't it impact these other things? Isn't your significant other annoyed because you're not getting anything done at home or helping with chores? Isn't your significant other annoyed because you're not listening and you can't, focus in on conversations? So especially when it comes to kids who have pretty severe cases, it's like, hey, if they're a mess Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, then they're probably having impairment in their social development, those social skills. And as we said, Max, their self-esteem. If they can't participate in conversations, we think of ADHD kids as like spazzes, which you were describing, having a lot of that growing up, then we want these kids to develop a healthy self-esteem and feeling like they know how to function in this world. And so I think it's important, obviously, Max, for a person to find themselves in a place where their skill set is valued like you have, but also recognizing that this isn't just like a homework-based condition. This impacts relationships too.
My girlfriend and longtime partner, Jenny, would tell you that it's been a process with us in terms of communication over the years, often because I'm just overly excited about whatever it is that she's talking about and I want to have input right away. And that's not necessarily how she likes to communicate. She would like to, tell her story from beginning to end, which is very normal. Right.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Wow. Women, am I right? I can't
Right.
believe she wants to
Right.
communicate.
100%. So, right. But this is something that took learning from my end and patience from her end
Of course.
of understanding that this is something that I was working towards and working on within myself. And over the years, I think we've gotten a much better and healthier way of communicating. Often now, where if I am interrupting or if my attention is waning, she has a great way of pulling me back in politely so that I'm not also like flustered by polite interruption or lack of attention or whatever you
It can go a lot of ways, right? Your partner asks you to let them finish, and then you either get offended right? You externalize and you blow up, or you internalize, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And then it's like, okay, well, just chill. I just want to get back to the point I was making, right? So Max and Jenny, we talked about this way back when you were on the first time. Really do think about things ahead of time and communicate what you have to do when you have a neurodivergent partner of any kind, because you're both going to communicate uniquely. I might argue that we need to be communicating this well, regardless of any neurodivergence in either people in a relationship. But this bothers me. How can we handle it? This bothers me. How can we handle it? Right? And you do that not when you're screaming at each other, but when you're relaxed and you can make those plans. So Max is well aware that if he is cutting Jenny off, she's going to have a way of saying, honey, let me finish. He won't get mad. He knows this is coming. He can practice, tolerating the distress of having yourself interrupted, Max, right? No punching washing machines as we did back in the summer, and really make positive strides in that way. Positively, Max, how do you think that you use ADHD in a helpful way at this point in your life?
Yeah, I mean, that comes down to like my career, the choices I've made in life. I've talked about, my struggle with like formal education. However, from a young age, I've always thrived in a kitchen. And I think it's from the multi-sensory inputs that you are in charge of when you're in a kitchen. You have something going on the stove, and you have something in the oven, and you have something that you need to be cutting and something you need to be keeping an eye on. And it seems to align perfectly with the way my brain is already somewhat wired to work. The food moves as quickly as my brain does, is what it seems like.
Max's also go-to kind of thing to help him zone in. And we hear about people with ADHD being able to hyper focus, and usually that's on preferred activities. So video games, media, reading. Max is one of his being cleaning. So that works really well around the house, and in the kitchen as well. Max, do you think there's any common misconceptions or things you'd want people to know about growing up with or having ADHD?
I don't know about misconceptions, but personally, I feel like there were times where you feel like an outsider a little bit, like where you feel like you're being singled out because you're the one in class interrupting, or you're the one in the friend group that can't, keep their mouth shut at a certain time, or whatever it is, where you're like, why do I act this way regardless of whether I want to, and that can be tough. And then also finding, real life solutions for those is probably what's even harder, because it's easy to like be like, I know these are the problems, but going through your like day-to-day life on how to fix them is like a whole nother thing. And like same thing with like working in a kitchen. I like, started out, I just did line cook things, right? You had a ticket in front of you, you cooked that ticket, you moved on to the next ticket, or you're doing a couple tickets at the same time, but whatever it was, you're just going from one thing to another, and it doesn't really require any kind of planning. And at this stage in my life, I've been, in charge of kitchens for a long time, and I've had to develop, I think, tricks, tools, whatever, to make it work for myself, being in charge of not just myself, but being in charge of all the other people around me, being in charge of inventory, and being in charge of scheduling, all those things that was not the reason that I got into the cooking world, right? I got in because it's like a perfect way for me to not have to do those things originally. I was like, I can just cook and not have to do homework, not have to do, writing assignments. And I spend so much of my day, writing recipes, writing procedures, writing.
When you said tips and tricks, like what?
For me, it's just a lot of lists, right? Like I work best if I have just like the tickets we get coming into the kitchen. That's all, this is the order of how you need to do things. This is what needs to be done when. List for myself is the same thing as those tickets. Every chef is writing lists and recipes and this and that, but that's not something that comes naturally to me. So it took like a lot of years of me being like, I can't just do this all in my head. There are other people that I work, and that's also as my job and title and kitchens have grown that I've worked in, I've had to make those changes gradually, where it started on a food truck where I was really just in charge of myself. And so it was easy to just fly by the seat of my pants.
Yep.
And I didn't have to write any procedures or list or, I just did everything. So, but where I struggle in my personal life is I'm not good at doing those things necessarily in my home life. So things often get ignored at home until it's like, in terms of like cleaning, right? I'll ignore it for a while because I don't have a list of like at work. I have a list of cleaning tasks for the week. I have a list of cleaning tasks for the month. I have a list of clean tasks for the day. I have, it all organized. At home, I don't necessarily always do that, where I do the list, but then ignore the list. So what's the point of the list? You stop writing the list. So then I have a day where I just then hyper focus and spend my entire day maybe cleaning my house from top to bottom rather than doing one or two things a week or a day gradually.
And
So
we
being
thank
able to like
Max
import
for
those.
taking we thank Max for taking a bit out of his hyper-focused cleaning day before football starts to join us in this interview. Max, have you heard of the Pomodoro technique? Probably not by name, but the idea, it's similar to actually what you said earlier, but more of an emphasis on positive versus wander time. It's like setting timers of like productivity, break to wander, productivity, break to wander.
Okay.
So just that idea of kind of setting breaks, timers, really effective, guys. Obviously keeping schedules lists, leveraging technology, or just a list of things that, I think about with patients.
Well, as far as the Pomodoro technique, I believe is what you called it, that's definitely something that I've tried to put into those days of like hyper cleaning my house or cooking all day or thing at home or something like that, where for myself, I call it like a reward system. Do something you don't want to do for however long that takes, but then you get to reward yourself with the whatever TV show I've been wanting to watch, or just scrolling on my phone for 30 minutes or whatever it might be. But that does seem to be what's most effective, but that goes along with also having like a list for myself of things that I want to accomplish. So if I don't have that list, the break pretty quickly turns into that's just the rest. I do accomplish one thing, you take the break, and that's done.
Well, that's what I was going to say, holding yourself accountable to come back to the list of things, which is certainly a maturity thing and something I'm sure, Max, you're better at now than you were when you were 26 and 16, thinking back in your past. So it's interesting, Max, the only condition that in my clinical practice I will tell people as far as behavioral treatment goes, just go Google ADHD behavioral interventions, ADHD, behavior techniques. Fortunately, there's a lot of people who've got good strategies, different list making techniques, things like that you can find a lot of good stuff on the internet, tease through the snake oil and those kinds of things. But a lot of people really have made great strides in this. And of course, we know a lot of really successful people, musicians, actors, scientists. I mean, people all over the map that have succeeded with ADHD and found ways to do well with it. And Max, you're a really good example of when you find your niche with ADHD in particular, it becomes really, really a place to thrive and not a place to struggle like the traditional classroom may have been. So Max, thanks for coming on, man. We're going to kick off the neurodivergence block with a condition that most of us, at least have had some experience or understanding of it. And the goal of this session, being able to have people just understand the perspective and what it's like to live with these various neurodivergent conditions. So thanks for starting us off, brother. Love you. This week's Bromotions Hall of Fame inductee is none other than Ken himself, Ryan Thomas Gosling, born November 12, 1980 in Toronto, Canada. Doesn't he just seem like a Canadian? Just the sweetest boy, Ryan Gosling. The son of a paper mill salesman and a secretary, was raised in a Mormon home. Now, Ryan has not been out very much officially talking about ADHD or having ADHD, but we want to make sure we're identifying people who may have, likely would have. He was homeschooled for a while, but listen to this, he really fit the bill in terms of his behavior and showing ADHD traits. As we've talked about earlier in the episode, he struggled in school with socializing and his behavior. We never want to say one moment could lead to a diagnosis, but Ryan was suspended in first grade for bringing knives to school because he wanted to imitate something he'd seen on TV, and he was throwing knives at kids. So ADHD, impulsivity, Check. He had pretty poor reading skills, and he himself has been quoted as saying he didn't have any friends until he was 14 or 15. Which is interesting because we know his start came on the Mickey Mouse Club. Maybe he struggled socially with Brittany and Christina and Justin. He went on to expand into the child world there. He was on Are You Afraid of the Darks and Goosebumps, Millennials Shout Out. And then, as we know, he was an absolute liability on defense in the Remember the Titans movie, one of the best of all time. If you've never seen Run, Don't Walk. Big break came in 2004 when he was in The Notebook, followed by some great roles in things like Crazy Stupid Love, Drive, Barbie. We've already talked about Ken, what a role. And then the movie Fall Guy with Emily Blunt. If you haven't seen it, also super good. Just the song I'm Just Ken, which Ryan had a big role in creating, really was an inspiration in helping men in that field. And when that movie was huge, talking about the insecurity that can be the role of being men, and then, of course, being pigeonholed into certain things like Ken was in that movie. An inspiring dating record, our guy Ryan. Of course, he's easy on the eyes. He's dated Sandy Bullock, Rachel McAdams, and Eva Mendes. They've been together for a long time, and they have 2 young kids. In Good Guy Land, Ryan is a supporter of PETA, and his main charity of focus over time has actually been addressing advocacy and awareness of genocide and child endangerment in Africa, supporting both the Invisible Children and the Enough projects. He's traveled to Chad, Uganda, Eastern Congo to raise awareness about conflicts in that region, and has been working for over a decade in promoting peace efforts in Africa. So Ryan speaks for himself as a good guy, a well-known good guy in Hollywood, as we search to find more and more of those guys who've been able to withstand some rough goes as a kid and go on to become a real role model in the promotion space. And so we'll wrap inductee this week with just some clips. Ryan was interviewed for the Wall Street Journal of him just being nice.
The one surprising thing about being a dad.
It's even better than they say. I think they undersell it. There's things like dad bod, dad jokes. There's a little bit more side-eye there than I think it deserves.
What's one parenting secret you've learned?
Just snacks. Always have snacks. I've learned it the hard way. When you don't have it, you want to have them. You'll always be holding. ABHS. Always be holding snacks.
What's your one secret to handling fame?
Just don't Google yourself.
What's the one role you'd like to do over?
Maybe La La Land.
Tell me one piece of advice you'd give to a hopeless romantic.
Ooh, well, don't do that. Don't lose hope. Don't do that. That's rule number 1. Keep the hope.
Oh, Ryan, I won't lose hope. We'll never lose hope. We'll be back to wrap up after the break. All right, let's cite our sources and get our takeaways this week. Sources, helpguide.org, and many other mental health websites are really great as far as helping with focus, concentration, ADHD type symptoms if you struggle with that. Chef Max, he didn't bring any resources, just life experience. If you're in Ohio, the city of Columbus, check out his restaurant, Stack Burger Company, up in the northern suburbs of the 614. Used Wall Street Journal's interview with Ryan Gosling to get information off him there from Wikipedia, as we usually do. 3 takeaways for this week as we reflect on an episode focused on focus, concentration, and attention deficit disorder. 1, there's a lot of reasons we have difficulty concentrating and a lot of things we can do about it without necessarily reverting to substances or needing medications. 2, it's tough inside the mind of somebody with ADHD and the experience as a kid. So I want you to take away that if somebody is a difficult kid, they're out of control, if you're a parent, remind yourself this isn't fun for them. They're doing the best they can. And that if they're known for being trouble in class, not being able to sit still, it likely impacts their self-esteem. So let's remember that people are doing the best they can at any given time with what they've got. And number 3, Ryan Gosling. What a guy. That's really mostly what I got. But also the idea that you can go from, taking knives to school and chucking them at people and growing up into a great, nice young man, a kind man, and a good father. So our past does not have to dictate our future. How about that for our 3rd takeaway? And as always, let's help some people dictate good, kind futures out there in the world this week. I'll see you next time.